Hey guys, so today we're going to learn about sass, the synthetically awesome style sheet. If you're an HTML, CSS developer, front-end developer, sass would definitely help you overall organize your project nicely and overall improve your style sheet. As the name says, synthetically awesome style sheet, which means it will help you improve your syntax. So the readability improves and also maintainability improve as we will look at how it does. And this is basically not a very huge subject. We can easily cover in a couple of sessions. There is another name for it also. So previously, as I said, sass, synthetically awesome style sheet, also called sassy CSS or SCSS. And I'll tell you why that is now, the change of the name. It was originally called sass, but nowadays it's called SCSS, but most of the people refer to as sass. The SCSS is actually the file extension that you would use to create sass files. So SASS is actually SCSS. I know it's pretty confusing, but it is what it is. So, what is sass, first of all, if you may ask? It's a better syntax compared to CSS. Why that is? Well, first of all, browser only understand CSS. It's built in inside the browser so that whatever HTML and CSS you write, it interprets that and then it builds the page based on that. Now, the problem with CSS is it was built a long time ago, and the mistakes they made, whoever designed it, there are lots of mistakes that were made in initial versions. And the way with the web, anything you put in a browser stays there forever for compatibility reasons, right? Uh, so it's not very intuitive when it comes to readability. Um, CSS is global. What does it mean? If you define something in one place, it applies everywhere. And so that creates a problem. So that's why we need something that helps you write CSS in a completely different form. But eventually it will compile to CSS. So we don't have to worry about writing CSS. We just write everything in the syntax of sass. So this is how it works. So you would have an SCSS file where you write your styles, and there's something called preprocessor. It's a code that is written for sass. It will compile, or should I say, transpile in a way. It processes and it produces CSS file, and that will be actually used in your project. So you never modify CSS directly. You always modify a CSS file. And that's the beauty of it. So let's look at how to actually use it. There are multiple ways to use it. If you're learning, I would recommend the first way. But ultimately, you have to install it somewhere. So let's look at without installing. So when you're learning something, it's always easy to find a solution without installation, so you can play around with it. So there's a playground for it called CodePen. So if you go to the codepen.io, it will give you this interface where you have HTML, CSS, and JS, and here, whatever you write here, it will render your page here. So for example, let's say if I have a div, and I can write something called test or hello world. And if I want to style this, I can simply say, whenever you find a div, I need to give a color of, let's say, red. right? And you can see it renders here. Okay, so this is a nice thing. We're not going to use JavaScript, so we can hide it here so we have enough space. But again, we're writing CSS here and not sass, but there is a way to do it. If I go inside here and it opens us 3 tabs here: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and it would select CSS, and there is something called CSS preprocessor, and there are multiple preprocessors available. There is less, there is SCSS, again this old format sass, but we are only going to look at the SCSS format. There's a stylus and there's post CSS. So let's pick SCSS and then save. So now it says CSS, but next to it says SCSS, which means it will respect anything that that you write in a sass format or SCSS format. But the good news is any normal CSS you write is sass compatible, but any sass you write is not CSS compatible. You have to pre-process it, right? So let's look at other points, variables. So in CSS, you may need to use some variables. Why would you need to use some variables? There are common things that you may use, like for example, let's say if you have a color, like a background color of your page that is defined by some hex code. Now, a lot of your pages will have the same background. Now, every single page you have to write that color when you write the CSS. What if you can make it as a variable? And the reason for it, let's say in future if you want to change background color of all those pages, you have to only change it one place. Because it's a variable, it's easy to change rather than going into each style and manually modifying all those colors. So that's why we have variables, which doesn't exist in CSS. Well, CSS has sort of like a variable, which was introduced much later, but we're not going to cover that in this class, but we're only going to look at the sass variables. So I'm going to, so there's a red color here. So instead of red, I can actually create a variable, and I can say my background or something. Okay. And then I would say red. Now I've created a variable, and instead of using this red, I can simply use this my background. Okay, and it works the same way. Actually, this automatically refreshes. If I want to manually do it, I would have to go to settings, and if I go to behavior, and there's a second option here called auto updating preview. I'm just gonna remove it because I prefer a control. So when I change something, I want to click on a run and I want to see the effect. I don't want it to automatically run something. So now instead of red, if I say green and it doesn't update it here, I would have to actually run it. And now it changed to green. So this variable is pretty useful. Let's say if I have span, and I can say hi there, and run it, it would put hi there here, which doesn't have any color right now. But let's say if I want to apply the same color as well, actually this is not actually background, it's a font color, so I would say my font color. I like to keep things more readable because background is actually background, not font color. Okay, so now I'm gonna do is for span, I can also apply the same color. So I can do this, And when I run it, it will have the green color as well. If I want to change it again to, let's say, blue, and done it again, it's changed to blue both places. So any div that you find in an entire website, remember I said CSS is global, which means any div that you find anywhere. So if I create a bunch of divs, because I apply style to div, all the divs going to be blue. And you can see it's applied to that. I wanna see actually, this is a sass format. I wanna see actually what CSS it produces, right? So I can go here and I wanna see view compiled CSS. If I click on here, it shows me compiled CSS. So I don't see any variables. All I see is two things. One is div, one is span, and they both have blue colors. Okay, so this is what it actually produces, and this is what your browser understands. Imagine if there were like 50 such elements and I have to put blue everywhere and I have to change it manually by going one by one. It would be too much, right? And this is just a simple example. Once you start coding a lot in CSS, you would see similar scenarios where you have to go and modify things because your product requires. Suddenly, you want to change your theme of your website because of the product related issues. At that point, you don't want to go and look for certain colors and then manually change every. It's too much work and it can produce a lot of errors. If I want to go back to sass, all I have to do is, again, I cannot then modify here. As you can see, it won't let you modify anything. And that's a good thing because once you go by sass, you want to only modify sass. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense, right? So I would say view uncompiled sass as CSS file. Now I'm back to that and I can see it here. Okay, so this is one example of how it works. Now, as for resources, let's look at resources. If you search on SCSS, so this website, sass-lang.com, has pretty comprehensive documentation on how to use it. It has implementation guide and all of that. You can look at I usually like learn sass, which is pretty important. And if you look at the amount of stuff it has, it's not that much. So you can actually learn everything in a couple of days because you have to practice as well. So the first part, the installation, we'll cover that a little later because since we're using this CodePen, we don't have to go through this step, but we will ultimately cover it. Now we looked at a variable where in order to define a variable, you have to use this $sign in front, and then you can use colors. We can actually use this fonts. So let's go back here, and I can use font. Okay, and here I would say font family is say dollar font dash stack, and obviously have to run it. And you can see that the font of div is all Helvetica, and the default font, which is the span, is different. And I can look at the viewed compiled CSS, which shows me that div has the font family, and this is because I haven't defined here, it would have a default one. And we can actually look at it if I go inspect it. And inside the element tab, span, and I can look at, see, I can see the color is blue, but things that we haven't defined, I would have to go to computed property. And here I can filter it, so I can say font family, and I can see that it's actually by default it's times. But for this guy, as you can see, the font family is Helvetica. And this is actually, if you don't Helvetica, then it falls onto sans serif. So usually when you define font family, you define multiple, which means if this is not available, use this one. If this is not available, use this one. And if nothing is available, then use whatever the default font is. Okay, so now that we looked at the variables, again, there could be many different variables. You can use this many different ways. The fun part that I really like is nesting. And this is where you would have to use, you're going to be using a lot of nesting. And when I code in CSS, I use a lot of nesting. If you are curious, the previous format, sass, remember there are two formats, SCSS, which is the latest format, and the original format, which is SASS, the original name where it comes from. If I click on here, the only difference is you see the curly brackets are missing and then semicolons are missing. So this used to be, when it was developed, it was quite unusual, and so that they end up, it wasn't working out for them, so they end up using this one where it's close to CSS kind of format, so, which makes more sense. So I would recommend never to use this SS format. Always use SCSS format, and that's what they recommend as well. Okay, so what is nesting really means? So for that, let's look at a pretty important example. In order to look at the nesting, I would have to create a nested structure, which means a tree structure, because that's how HTML is, a tree structure. So let's create an element, a div, with some sort of class. We're gonna call it grandpa. And this is actually a cool trick in CodePen, that you would put the element name and then dot, which means you want to assign a class, and you would say whatever the name of the class is. In this case, is say grandpa, and then hit tab, and then it presents itself like this. So you don't have to type all those tedious stuff. Okay. Now inside I want to create, so I would say div dot parent. Let's say call parent 1 or something like that. I'll just say parent. And inside that, I can create a child. And inside that, I would have some element call hello world. And right now, I've not styled it at all. In CSS, there's something called specificity. So CSS run on specificity. So what is specificity really means? Specificity is, again, because I said CSS is global, which means things, you can apply style to any element so many different ways. For example, I can say this is a div, right? So I can say I want to style all the divs with font, let's say color red, right? When I run it, it would change it to red. Now, there's another way to say, I can say, okay, I want to, anytime I see child class named child, I want to make it blue. So I can say dot, because it's a class, I have to use a dot operator, dot child, and then I would say color is green. And if I run this, I would get green. So what happened to this guy, right? Why this is not applied and this is applied? Well, you may be thinking because this is first and this is second, maybe this is this way. Let's change the order here. And if I run this, no change. So it is actually applying green. Okay, now let's do even more fun things. I want to say that there's another selector where it says uh, only child with the parent would be the parent. So I can say parent and child. So any child where there is a class parent class, apply color to be blue. Make sense? And when I run this, it actually applies blue. So now these two are ignored. If I move this up or middle or center, let's say, there is no change. So from all these three elements, I'm applying this to hello world, and one of them is being picked, which is this guy. That is because this is more specific. So when you have conflicting styles, your browser would say, okay, which one is more specific? This is more specific. For example, if I say, if there's a crowd and I would say, hey John, there may be 10 different Johns in that crowd, right? They would all raise their hands. But I can say John Peterson, then there will be only one John Peterson. And so only that guy would raise his finger, right? Because it's more specific. Let's say there are two John Peterson in the crowd. And then I can say, hey, John Peterson, son of David Peterson. Now, one of them is actually son of David Peterson. So he would raise his finger, right? It is way more specific. The same thing happens in CSS. Because if you look at div, this is too generic, okay? Any div. So CSS picks child over this because child is very specific. Then child with parent class is even more specific. So that is why all these styles are being ignored and this is being applied. Okay, so when you are styling, because the CSS is global, by unknowingly you can apply style that you were not aware of. So if I just remove this, for example, and run it, you think that you actually changed the style. You remove the color, but you don't know which color would be applied because some other style somewhere would impact it. So that is why you always, whenever you define your style, you always want to be specific. Never do something like this. Okay. So we're gonna remove that. Now, when you have something like this, how does it really work out? So this basically says any child, any class child, where its immediate parent is class parent. So this is how it actually works. Now, what if you have another element here inside here? And we're going to call this child 1 and child 2. In that case, I have to do something like this. And let's say if I want to apply this here, green. And if I run this, one of them is blue and one of them is green. So it makes sense. So this is how you can specifically apply your styles. But if you look at here, the parent here is redundant. If there was a way where we can say, okay, inside a parent, child 1 should be blue and child 2 should be green. So there's a better syntax. So what we can do is we can nest it. I can remove the parent from here and I can wrap the whole thing with a parent because that's more logical. And if I format this, and so now I've removed that redundancy from here, and then the nesting, which actually makes sense, I can see things clearly now. If I run this, it works the same way. And if I look at the compiled CSS, I can see it did exactly the same thing what we did before in CSS. So it produces this. But actually when you write it like this, which makes more sense. And this is just a simple example where you have a one parent-child relationship. Imagine if you have a much deeper nested structure, which is 5 levels down, right? In that case, if you write this, you would have much longer, and then it becomes very hard to manage. So this looks more natural. Okay, so let's look at different example where you have instead of having parent-child relationship, let's say if you have two different classes that apply to the same element. So let's say if I have a div with class something called common, and it also has another class called child. So now it has two classes, same element. And I also have another div with class common and also class child. Let's call this child 2. And this would we call it child 1. And this is actually wrapped around with a parent. So div and this is called, let's say, child 1, child 2. Now, if I want to style this, if I want to say, because there's a common class called common, again, my poor use of word, usually I would write something like this. I can say, for the first element, I would say parent, and then there's a child relationship, child 1. And if I want to add common, then I would, instead of putting breaks here, I would say common. So this is a selector where you want to say apply both classes. And if I put a space, it's a parent-child relationship. If I don't put a space, which means apply both classes to the same element. And here I can say color to be, let's say, red. I can do the same thing here, and this would be, let's say, child 2, and this would be green. Now, if I want to do something like this, where this is redundant and this is redundant in both, we can do something like this. So if I just remove this, and I would have first parent, as a nesting. Then I have two elements. folders, right? One I have dot child1, as we previously looked at, and then second is dot child2, and then I can put obviously color is red, and here color is green. But I also want to use this common class to both. So I can do something like this. I can say common, and I just wrapped around both child1 and child2. But this is not a parent-child relationship. If I format this, this looks like a parent-child relationship. I don't want this parent-child relationship. Uh, so if I don't want to have a parent-child relationship, I would have to use something called end here. And what this would do, it says have both classes common and child applied to the same element. So it's this is more like a nesting. This is applying the same, but because common is common to both child1 and child2, I can pull it like this. If I look at the view compiled CSS, I can see that it did the same thing that we wanted to do previously, right? So this is the beauty of it. So you can pull comments. It's just more readable in that sense. And once you get used to it, you can read this way better because you can see things better. Okay, what if I want to apply another style to common as well? So let's say common has a font size, let's say font size to be 40 pixels, right? And I can write it like this. If I run it, both child1 and child2 has 40 pixel font size, even though I only define it in one place. And if I look the view compiled, you can say it now says 3. It produces 3 styles here. All right, so now that we know a little bit about Sass, now let's go back to the installation part. Because sooner or later you would have to do it if you want to build a project that uses Sass. So you would need a setup where you can write a file with Sass format, and then you needed that preprocessor, Sass preprocessor, that would convert your Sass file, SCSS file, to CSS file, and then you can use that CSS file in your project. So for that, we're gonna use CodePen, and it's not CodePen, sorry, a Visual Studio Code. Okay, if you don't have it, please install it, and you can just go to search on Visual Studio Code. It's pretty popular editor. And then from here, if you open a terminal, which is available inside, so it actually opens a terminal, and I am inside this sass-proj folder. Okay, so you need to install a preprocessor that would help you convert that file. So for that, I would have to run this command, npm install -g sass. So let's understand this command. npm is a node package manager. So there's something called node package manager. So there's a registry. So if I Google it, npm sass, or I would see this here. So this is a registry where this file is located, and if I want to download it, I would need to install via that npm command. And then g means install globally, which means it installs globally on your computer. So you don't have to install every time. For one project, you can use it. From another project, from a different folder, you can use it as well. Once you install, it's there. Okay, so let's do that. It installed. You can see it's installed inside a node, some folder. So it gives you a path where it's actually installed, and you can look at it. But we're not going to look at inside. We just wanted to install it. So now that is available, we can create our file. Let's call it input.scss. And you can see it automatically uses the symbol for that, sass. And what we're going to do is, we already did a bunch of work here, right? We already know what this compiles into, which is this, right? So we can copy this and then paste it here. Okay, and then we need to run this command called sass dash dash watch, and we need to provide the input file, which is input.scss, and then what would be the output file? So it's output.scss or css, sorry. So scss to css, and again, we don't have this file yet, so it will create automatically. And if you already have a file, it will override it. Okay, and watch means watch for any changes to this input file automatically, and it's pretty cool. So once I do that, as you can see, it automatically creates this file, and it's exactly like what we expected. As we can see, it looks exactly like this here. So it changed it. So this is our input file, this is our output file. Now, if I want to use this project, I can create an index.html file and use this output.css file inside and just go start using. But I should not directly modify, never directly modify output.css, because every time it gets overwritten. So let's say in input, I can make this change. Instead of red, let's say I make it to blue. And as you can see here, it says sass is watching for your changes. So if I save this, see it compiles again. And if I look at the CSS file, it changed it to blue. If I add something here, let's say div colors black or something, okay, and save this. This is quite useless because as soon as, let's say if I change something here to red, it will override the output file. So all of the changes I made to the output file is gone. So you always want to work here in this SCSS files and never touch CSS. Only use it in your project. Okay, so this is how you would install sass on your computer and set up inside your project. So it watches for all your changes in sass. And there's actually more to it. If you have a bunch of files, then you need to set it up such that all of those automatically gets converted. Okay, we don't have that set up because we want to just take baby steps right now. Okay, so next session we're going to cover further into this topic, and we can actually finish it in 2 sessions. So since this is the first session, installation, variables, and we also looked at the nesting. Now let's look at the homework. I would like to just give the homework directly inside the video. So what you want to do is do exactly what I've done here. So create a folder called sass.project, do the installation following this step, npm install sass, and then run the watch command. So you can do it and pretty much write this file and get the output here. Now you also want to use this CSS. So remember, in here we created this HTML file, right? So here you want to create index.html file, and then write this div and this structure directly here, and then use this output.css file. Remember how you would use it, right? In the header, you can put a link so that that I think you should probably know if you are an HTML programmer how to use that. Um, and so once you use it, try to render it and make sure that you get this in your project. And then try modifying your SCSS file here. Change the color to get that reflected automatically in your web page. Okay, so that is the homework. It's not that hard. It should be pretty simple. Um, the setup can be sometimes complicated, but I think if you follow the instruction, it should be piece of cake. Okay, so yeah, we'll see you in next. And on the Friday, if you have any questions, please attend the session, and I can answer any question for you on that session. And thank you.